After environmental screening, the following step will be environmental scoping. The purpose of environmental scoping is to identify the key environmental issues to be studied during the environmental impact assessment, as there may be a lot of potential environmental issues, some of which will be relatively significant, while others can be negligible. Attention should be paid to those significant, so that in-depth study can be carried out during the environmental impact assessment. These are the steps for the environmental scoping. We have Site Suitability Assessment, SSA. During the Site Suitability Assessment, the proposed projects are compared with the approved development plans to determine the suitability of the site for the development. There may be situations where the proposed project site not contradicting to the approved development plan or any other guidelines prescribed by the Departments of Environment. However, the site exhibits certain critical characteristics, imposing constraints to the proposed project. In other words, during the site suitability assessment, we will examine the site constraints as well as conducting certain technical studies. The project proponent may re-evaluate the project concept, design and component, considering the alternatives and options for the proposed concept as an effort to refine and improve upon the original concept design. The principle here is, when there is an existing concept design, the project proponent should also consider if there is any possibility to make the concept design better, taking account the site constraint and other technical issues. This is about the site suitability assessment. The next step, it will be the determinations of study boundary. When we talk about the study boundary, pay attention in two phrases: zone of study, ZOS, and zone of impact, ZOI. The two phrases seem to be similar. They are referring to a zone or an area, but by definitions they were different. Zone of study refers to the areas that to be studied while conducting the environmental impact assessment. However, the zone of impact may not necessarily be the same as the zone of study. The impacts can go beyond the zone of study. Now, in the second stage here, we are to determine the study boundary. That means the qualified persons should determine the extent of the zone of study and the zone of impact. The guideline provides an illustrations distinguishing the zone of study and the zone of impact. It says that the zone of study is the study area generally encompasses a 5 kilometers radius zone from the project boundary. By looking at the figure here, let's say this is your project site. The project boundary is here. Now your zone of study will encompass 5 kilometers radius distance from the boundary of your project site. That gives you, this is the zone of study. However, the potential impacts for the project may extend beyond the zone of study, and the impact area is known as the zone of impact, as illustrated by the figure here. Now, the impact regions can go beyond 5 kilometers from the project boundary. Having the zone of study identified, now the qualified person will have to obtain necessary relevant information on the project and the surrounding zone of study through various means, either from the secondary sources available or through the preliminary data gathering at the site. Now, why do we need to determine the boundary? The purpose here is to set the boundary, to gather the informations for the baseline for the terms of reference. What does it mean by the baseline? It means that the current conditions of the environment. In order for you to monitor the impacts due to a development, you need a reference point, which is the baseline. By observing the differences between the baseline and the post-development conditions, we are able to quantify the degree of impacts due to the development. That's why having the baseline is important. Knowing the importance of baseline, we need a clear-cut boundary for us to gather information representing the current conditions of the environment. Now, based on the guideline, it shall be within the zone of study. Next, the level of details for the environmental study shall based on factors such as the project area size, type, activities, potential impacts to surrounding areas. Since that we're talking about the baseline, and we are still at the early stage of the environmental impact assessment, the first milestone for the environmental impact assessment, it will be for the establishment of the terms of reference. The terms of reference set the objectives, scopes, and the methods of the environmental impact assessment. To make it simple, you can consider this stage, the environmental screening process as well as environmental scoping process are the preliminary studies for the establishment of the terms of reference. Now, getting the baseline during the environmental scoping can comprise of qualitative informations that is adequate to assess the potential impacts resulting from the project on the sensitive receptors. Since it is the early stage of the environmental impact assessment, the focus here is between yes or no. We are talking about identifying the potential impacts. Therefore, a simplified version of baseline study can be conducted. Later, there will be another stage, gathering quantitative information as the baseline. This is about the baseline data review, which is the third step of the environmental scoping. Next, determinations of key project activities. The project proponent shall outline the key project activities that will be carried out in various phases of the project, which include the pre-constructions, during constructions, and operations. Pre-construction phase means that before the construction, the relevant activities include pre-feasibility, feasibility, and design stage of the project. This figure shows the typical project activities during the pre-construction phase. This includes site access, site survey, soil investigations, environmental assessment, land acquisitions, if any, and then the construction phase. Among the project activities include establishing access road, site clearings and biomass removal, base camp and site activity establishment, earthworks, establishing the post-bulk, land disturbance, pollution preventions and mitigations measures, worker recruitment, mobilizations, equipments and materials, constructions of the infrastructures, waste disposal, structural works and facility establishment, establishments of permanent access, and final finishing and landscaping. All these work activities are associated to the constructions of the structures and the infrastructures for the proposed development. Next, it will be for the operational phase. This comes after the construction phase, putting the development into operations. Now, the typical project activities related to the operational and the closure or exit phase include occupations and operations of project, infrastructures, utilities and amenities maintenance, site decommissioning, and rehabilitation works. By going through the key project activities, the project proponent may review the potential impacts to the environment as a result of these project activities. The next step now, it will be the identifications of significant impacts and priority. Again, we are still at the early stage of the environmental impact assessment, which is before the first milestone of establishment of the terms of reference. Therefore, this process of identifying the significant impacts and priority is basically a brief one, which is at the preliminary identifications. At least having this in place so that detailed assessment can be carried out at the later stage of the environmental impact assessment. It is noted that non-significant issues should also be addressed accordingly in the EIA study, but through general or qualitative impact predictions and evaluations. Next is the selections of mitigations measures. Based on the significant impacts identified earlier on, the qualified person should determine the potential mitigations measures needed to be provided in details in EIA. And then, preparations and submissions of ESI and TOR. ESI stands for Environmental Scoping Informations. TOR stands for Terms of Reference. What you see here, the environmental scoping is the early stage of the environmental impact assessment. The goal here is to draw the focus of the study to significant issues that brings significant impacts due to the development. The outcome of this scoping will be the environmental scoping information, representing the preliminary versions of the EIA, except not detailed enough or supported with solid evidence and data. Because the purpose of having this ESI is to come up with the terms of reference, establishing the methodology, scope, and the directions of the EIA. The information provided in the ESI should be adequate enough to make decisions during the establishment of the terms of reference. It is also stated that the scoping should encompass all the environmental aspects such as the physical, chemical, biological, socio-economic, to enable an overall evaluations of the significant impacts. At this stage, there shouldn't be any attempt made to exclude or to prejudge any issues of concern. We just want to know the focus and the emphasis of the EIA study and how it should be carried out. Evaluating the impacts is not the ultimate goal here. A preliminary ratings in terms of the significance of the impacts shall draw us attentions to the detailed studies at the later stage of the environmental impact assessment.